So to build a software, you need some sort of a method, some sort of a process, right? And that process we call it SDLC, which is a software development lifecycle. Um, and it's just like, if you were to take even a trip to somewhere, you need some sort of a process, right? Okay, you need to first plan it, buy a ticket, and then actually carry out the entire trip and so forth, right? So same thing with the software. Any software that we build for web that runs in a browser, or any software that we build for our phones, right? Definitely need some sort of a process and planning, design, develop, test, deploy, maintain. That you need all entire life cycle, right? So if we look at this text of the software development, like it's a process which is used to develop software. SDLC is a step-by-step procedure need to be followed by the organization to design and develop high-quality product. The phase of software SDLC, which describes how to develop, maintain particular software. The life cycle aims to develop a good quality product. Software SDLC produces intermediate products that can be reviewed to check whether they work according to the customer requirements or not, right? So SDLC is also known for software development process. Some company may just say that, it doesn't matter. SDLC also approach creates considerable documentations, where the documentation helpful to make sure the requirement can be traced back to the stated business requirements. So during this cycle, we build a lot of documentations. I mean, think of something like Amazon.com, right? If you don't have proper documentations, there's no way you can maintain that code base or requirements, right? So it's very important, as tedious it is, right? I hate documentation as well, but it's very important to do that, right? So that's one part of our job. Our job is not always writing code, right? That's one part of your job, right? But that's probably like 1/3 of your job. But the rest, you have to do documentation and things like that. Um, and it is a framework which has set to tasks performed in each phase in the software development process, right? So we kept saying product, right? So let's define those two terms. What is a product? Product is a software that automates manual tasks such as banking, transportation, social media, etc., right? Anything that used to be manual, so to speak, right? We used to go to think of like a teller, right? We used to go to teller. We give our cash or check, and then they usually carry out the deposit part of it, right? Or withdraw, same thing. But now you can take a picture of your check or something. You can't take a picture of your money, right? But you can take a picture of your check and deposit it, right? Or you go to an ATM, you can withdraw, just to kind of give you an understanding. Transportations, right? If in the past, if you were to fly somewhere, you needed a booking agent and all of that, you can kind of just use a website now and create an account and book anything you want. So we're used to that. None of you guys are new to this process. So we don't call it a software, right? We call that a product. So whatever software you're working or whatever product you do is actually a product, but product equals to software, right? So then comes, well, what is the software then, right? So software is a set of instructions, data or programs used to operate computers and execute specific tasks. Opposite of hardware, which describes the physical aspects of a computer, the software is a generic term used to refer applications, scripts, and programs. So hardware is just something that physically you can touch, right? Software, obviously, you can touch, you can interact with it, but you can't really physically touch, right? So if you think of software, from your Facebook to your Instagram to your Chase.com accounts to anything that we interact from a browser level, as well as from your iOS or Android devices, as well as server-side app, the apps that you don't even see, right? That kind of runs on the server side. All of it are pretty much called software, right? So that's that. But SDLC follows this workflow. So you first have something called planning, and we'll go over each of those steps. So we won't be high level, we'll get the definition for it in a little bit. So very first step, you have to plan it, right? What are you trying to build, right? Once you decide that, all right, okay, well, we have to design it, right? You can't just plan it, right? Once the planning phase is done, you have to design it, right? The wireframe or the UI, how is it gonna look like? What kind of the path the user is gonna take? Okay, so user goes to the login. Once it's logged in, what do we want to display, right? right? So let's say, it clicks on some other button or things like that. So full navigation, you have to build this out, right? So that's the design part, and then you have the actual coding part. So based on the requirement and the design, we stitch them together, right? So that's what the developers are pretty much doing. And then finally, you want to make sure this stitching was good, right? So that's when the test phase comes, and that's what your role is, right? So you want to make sure, believe it or not, company invests almost same money in testing as development, right? So it's a big industry. It's not to say that, okay, if you do the development job, you make more money or things like that. No, it's pretty much in the same ballpark, right? Um, at an early stage for sure. So, and you have to have equal knowledge as the developer, right? So that's why I emphasize a lot on Java and, low-level programming languages, things like that. Um, so just be, aware of that. So once the testing is pretty much good, what you guys have said, right? So let's say you've tested and, based on the plan and design, developer did build what it is supposed to build, right? And you tested that and you say it's okay, and then we'll deploy it, right? Deployment will send it out to the user, whoever the end users is. Now, end users can be someone that is internal to your company. We talked about a teller, right? Teller is not a public user, right? Teller is someone who works for a specific bank, right? So it's an internal user. So let's say we build a software for a teller. So the teller will pretty much use that app. That's called an internal app. Does that make sense? Right? And it stays within intranet, right? So it's not something that anyone else can access outside of their firewall, right? So it's kind of bolted within their own environment. And then you have a public app. Think of like Facebook again, right? If Facebook deploys something, it's open to the public, right? Like end users. Public users. End users can be an internal users within the company, right? Or public users who can be outside, just the general public that uses the app. And then finally maintained, right? So we're not done here. We're probably just getting started here, right? We just deployed it. So let's say if there's some bug happens and things like that in production, right? Some of you guys mentioned support and stuff like that, right? So that's when supporting, but that's not necessarily our job, right? Every time you run into an issue, you either write an email or you call someone, there's someone else picks up, right? So they will create that bug and they'll, we need to find out, is that a true bug? A lot of the time people just don't know how to use that software, right? So it's not really a bug, it's just they just didn't know how to use it, so the support team will kind of navigate them through that. So high level, this is kind of, anywhere you go, you probably have some sort of a workflow like this. Any questions on this? Are we good? All right, excellent. All right, so then we'll talk about planning and requirements phase, right? So this is the phase. It's pretty much done by, it could be a product manager, a project manager, or business analyst. This is just role name, right? So those individual pretty much does the planning and requirement phase. That's their job, right? That's where they work on. But that does not mean, testers not doing anything. We'll get there later. What the tester's job during this phase, right? Um, so the planning phase involves aspects of projects and product management. This may include a resource allocations, right? Which is, you don't do it every time. If it's a new project, maybe we are doing that, right? But once the project kind of gets started, we know what our resources is and, and the softwares that we need to have, right? But if the project continues to grow, obviously we'll do that. But that's not something that we have to pretty much worry about it. Capacity planning, project scheduling, cost estimation, provisioning, right? So as you can see, this is kind of a little bit of maybe the product manager will give us all those numbers saying, hey, I need to carry out this amount of work. How many automation engineers do you need, or what are you trying to build? Like based on the product, we'll allocate that. The output of the planning phase includes project plans, like we talked about that, schedule, cost estimation, procurement, requirement. Yeah, so this kind of stuff you can pretty much read, but high level, this is where we are gathering the requirement. what does the customer want, right? And make sure we have a proper requirement for that. And then, again, customer can be an internal customer within the company, right? And then customer can also be an external customer, right? Now the external customer is pretty hard, right? If you think of like Facebook, we don't really, I mean, they have to make some decisions based on users' behavior, right? They're not getting a direct feedback saying, hey, I want this feature, because sometimes users don't know what they want, right? Until you feed it to them. So, those are a little bit harder to so that's when the product team has to do a lot of market research, right? They probably have to get a lot of maybe volunteer users to come in and work with them, or consultants, right? Things like that. But in high level, what you want to get out of this phase is that, hey, what are we trying to build? So they use, let's say, a tool such as this, maybe, which you're going to be using in your final project, which is Jira, right? So let's say they're building these tools, and we can kind of build out what are we trying to do. So each ticket represents some stuff, right? And you can kind of move tickets based on priorities and things like that, right? So this is pretty much the tool they use to build all of those things, and this is pretty much the tool that developers, tester, everybody's on it all the time, right? But in high level, this is the phase where the product owners gathers requirements that needs to get built, for this project. All right. Any questions? Right. All right. Next is a lot of information here, and it's very important that we understand what do we mean by design. If you Google design phase, you're going to see 90 different things, right? Because it depends on which context are you asking the design is, right? So who's designing it? What are we designing it? So system versus UX and UI. How many of you guys heard of UX, UI? Okay, so a few people, right? It's also a very popular career now, right? If you're from an art background and things like that, a lot of people are moving into UX, UI. So system design, once the requirements are understood, we're talking about system design at this phase, right? So let's think of this diagram. But let's look into the definition for it, and then we'll go over the diagram a little bit. So there's two types of design that happens in design phase, right? System design and UX and UI design, all right? So the system design is once the requirements are understood. So let's say we understood the requirement, right? Software architects and developers can begin to design the software. The design process uses established pattern for application. Architecture and software development. Developer use proven design pattern to solve algorithmic problems in a consistent way. This phase may also include some rapid prototyping, also known as a spike. Now, these keywords are so important, right? If you got into study accounting, you would have to know all the accounting vocabularies, right? Yeah. So if you got into like transportation, you would have to know all of those vocabularies. So I want you to start noting down those new keywords that you're not familiar with, right? Things like spike. Um, so this is kind of like one of the, and I try to be mindful of highlighting them, but there are a lot of time I didn't do it. Um, so this phase may also include some rapid prototyping. So I think prototyping is something that we are very common. But if you don't understand those vocabulary, please ask me. What do I mean by that? Also known as a spike. To compare solution to find the best fit, the output of this phase includes all of those things, right? So system design is not something that you get to see, right? That's not what the user is seeing. So the software engineers or the architect, based on the requirement, they have to decide how am I going to design this, right? From the back end side of things, right? So think of something like this, they have to build out, right? So if you look at, and you don't have to worry about it, you don't have to know any of those information, right? All you have to understand is that system design is something the development team is doing, right? That's what you have to take away from that entire thing. And what are they doing? During this phase, they might build this prototype, right? And say, hey, we are thinking of building our this type of workflow for the software that we are trying to do. Honestly, product manager don't even know like what's happening there, right? So it's just within the engineering team itself, they're deciding how are they going to have the data flow, right? So let's say call comes here, it goes through this gateway, we use some Lambda stuff, right? and then we put it in some database, right? And then if we have to do some cloud formatting and all that stuff, so based on the requirement, we'll, the engineering team will build the system design. Does that make sense? So, but that's completely development team is doing that design stuff, right? But now, what we have to focus on. Go ahead.
What is Bombada and IAM
Don't worry about that stuff now, right? Think of like this is just back-end stuff that engineering team is doing. Like this is not something we have to know at all right? But what I really want you to take away from this slide is the difference between system design and UX UI design. System design is something the development team is doing of how are they going to build that software, all right? So they're designing that so they can start writing the code. You can't just start writing the code on a coding phase if you don't have something to work with, right? So you're doing a lot of like, research and development, prototyping. Spike is another thing, right? So the spike is used kind of another word for prototyping. You're just, you're not accounted for what you're working on. You're just kind of messing around with things of what works and what doesn't. All right, so the next is knowing the difference between UX and UI design. So UX design is user experience design, is the process of enhancing user satisfaction with the product by improving the usability, accessibility, and pleasure provided in the interaction with the product, right? So if you look at UX here in this diagram, so you're focusing on interaction design, wireframing, prototyping, information architect, user research, and scenarios, right? So this is not, so we take, let's say, our experience of, I don't know, posting something on Instagram, right? What's your experience of that? So we take that experience, right? We say, well, you know what, it takes too many clicks. People are not happy with that. Well, how can we make it better, right? So we do a lot of the wireframes and prototypes again here, right? And then we also take a lot of the user research. So user research is very important. So let's say we take a group of Instagram users, we put them in a room, right? And we give them a lot of different prototypes, and we kind of just understand their behaviors of how they're reacting to a specific type of workflow. Make sense? So we do a lot of those things. I mean, you can think of it, right? I mean, think of Snapchat or Instagram or Twitter or anything. Any of those apps, they're billion-dollar companies, so they invest a lot of money on everything that you do, right? Every click is thought out, every button, the color, everything is being thought out, right? So all of those decisions comes from this team, UX team, right? Now, if you work for a big company such as Facebook or Google and things like that, your job might be just doing UX stuff. Does that make sense, right? But if you are at a smaller startup or if at an enterprise level, you might do both, UX and UI work as well, right? So just be mindful of that. But again, this is not our role. This is part of our ecosystem, right? We have to know what these individuals do so that we can understand what our role and how we fit in with this entire team, right? And then comes UI design. So user interface design or user interface engineering is the design of user interfaces for machines and software such as obviously computer, home appliance, mobile devices, and other electronic devices with focusing on maximizing usability and user experience, right? So if we go back to this diagram again, the right side is visual design, right? How do you want your button to look like, your colors, graphic designs, layouts, typography, right? So these are all important, right? User interface is team pretty much focuses on that, right? How your logo should look like and all of those different things, right? Every single button, but the wireframe and the workflow or how the user will navigate through the app, that gets done through user experience team. Does that make sense? Any questions here? Hi. Yes, of course. Yeah. So UX thing is think of like your workflow of posting something on Facebook now, right? But now the team wants to improve it, right? Not the design of it, now how the button looks like or how your image looks like or whatnot, right? But actual navigation to posting your um, comments or a post into Facebook. So we take that existing experience and make it better, so to speak, right? So that team's job is to do that, but how they do it, right? So there'll be a lot of different prototypes. So maybe they will create different paths to get there, right? Because ultimately you have to post something. You have to post a comment. We want to get you there, but we want to get you with a very, you know, minimal steps, but it's not so minimal that it's so abstracted, right? That it confuses you more. So to solve all this problem, this team does a lot of user research, right? So let's say they will take a group of all of those students in this classroom that uses Facebook and try to give them a lot of prototypes and ask them a lot of questions, interview them, right? And based on that, they build it. Prototypes are something kind of like a mock-ups that you build, right? But they're not really finalized yet, but something that you're working with. And then once you know, yeah, just kind of like a sample project, but it's not final project, right? So you build a few of those sample projects and see users' reactions, and based on that, you make a decision.
So we can, I guess, basically simplify them like UI is like external and US is like internal.
You could say that, yeah,
Yeah,
right. Yeah, and then also user interface is mostly like visual stuff. Like if you guys are familiar with HTML, CSS, and all of those different things, right? But not
What's the innovation of UX?
user experience.
User experience.
Yes,
UI user.
user interface, right? So user interface is something that you see, right? User experience is something that you carry out. That's pretty much what it is. Any other questions here? All right. Again, this is not something you do, right? Again, this is our entire workflow. We have to interact with all of those teams, so we must understand what their role is, right? So during the meeting, if they say, "Hey, we're going to have we're going to do some user research," so you're not completely lost, right? I mean, you don't have to know how they do it, but you know what's going on here, right? And they might say, "Hey, based on user research, we're going to make a update on this existing requirement," right? So that's important, because if they update this requirement, then your test has to change, right? So you have to, obviously your meeting happens with all of those people, right? It's not just testing, is just one part of it. So you must understand their role, what they do, and all of those different things. Now, don't go home and try to learn user experience anyway. That itself is an industry, and it's a big courses, right? So just stick to what you have to do. But these are stuff that we just have to know, right? Okay. We'll do this, and maybe we can take a break. Well, then comes obviously development phase, right? Development slash coding. This phase produces the software under development depending on the methodology. This phase may be conducted in time-bound sprints. We'll talk about sprints, agile, all of this stuff later. Or may process as a single block effort. Again, we'll talk about agile and waterfall. But all you have to take away from this is, based on the requirement that came out of this phase and based on the design that came out of those, we're just teaching them together by writing code. That's all it is, right? So yes, we have the requirement. We want what the customer wants. We also we understand this is how you want your app to go, navigations and UI to look like. Well, that's not gonna make it work, right? So the developer comes in and they write some sort of program, right, to make sure they both kind of complement each other and go from there on. Make sense? I mean, this is probably the easiest part to explain. Now, there are two types of developer that you have to take into account, right? You have a back-end engineer and you have a front-end engineer, right? Does anyone know what a back-end engineer does?
So backend engineer is kind of like coding and all this stuff.
Well, coding, everyone's doing coding here, right? So back-end engineers also coding, front-end engineers are coding, right?
I guess more of like the backend does the starting work, like the wireframe and everything, and then the front end starts after it's all.
What do you mean by wireframe? Because that means totally different thing. That's what I'm saying, right?
Like,
What's your name again?
Like developing the software and stuff. My name is Malik.
Okay, Malik. So you say wireframe, right? In which context did you mean wireframe?
I meant like like you're actually starting like a development of a software, like making steps through and into it.
Okay, that's good.
The backend engineer is basically the person who takes care of the database, and front end is more the front end side of
Okay, that's good.
the
That's a good
how
analogy.
visual the website is going to look.
All right. Let me draw something. I think I shared documentation. You guys didn't read it.
Did, but I don't remember it that well.
Yeah, don't blame me. I wouldn't read it either, okay? Right? Just very simple one, right? We're gonna go over this in a lot details later. So let's say DB, right? DB means database, and then you have API, right? And then you have the UI. So someone that works with API and database, the user doesn't see it, right? So these are called backend engineers, right? Someone who, and you don't have to worry about what API is or database is just yet, right? Um, but then someone that works on the front end side of things, right, such as web applications or iOS app or an Android app, something the user interacts with, right? They're classified as a front end engineers, right? Someone that can do all of it is called full stack engineer. But in reality, it's not anyone does all of it. It's a lot of work, right? Itself. Unless again, if you're working on some sort of startup, you might be asked to do all of that, right? Which is good and bad because you're really not getting really good at one thing, right? You're kind of doing all of the work and you know how to build an app, but you really don't know, you didn't really grow a career in that side of things. So um, you can think of, but we have a single API, right? And then you can think of an Android app for that API, right? We can think of an iOS, and then we can think of the web, right? And we'll talk about all the languages that. So, as you can see, we're all consuming the single API, right? Because the information, let's say you log into your chase.com, your bank balance doesn't change between devices, right? So we are storing our balance here, but we use this middle layer to pass through the information, right? So you can access it from any devices, right? However, this part is what the backend engineers kind of works on, right? And then you have a dedicated Android developer, iOS developer, and then web, the application that you access to a browser, that's a web developer, right? So just to get an understanding, anything that a user interacts with, you can think of as front end engineers, right? Anything kind of like deals with the backend side of things like API or database, that's a backend engineer's responsibility. All right. Yeah, so yeah, coding is pretty much you stitching the requirement with the design and make sure it's working as expected. All right, I think we've reached 53 minutes mark. Any questions from online? All right, if you don't have a question, just put a thumbs up so we know that um, you don't have any questions. Okay, Deepak, are we good? All right.
Nice. Okay.
Oh, it's the app. Wait, what
Yeah.
is that?
Park NYC.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I was in Canada a year ago and they're so up to date. This was already a thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's
Here in the city, it's like, yeah, it's a hit or miss. I was gonna ask you actually, as far as job placements, is there a state that you guys send students to more than others?
Yeah, Wyoming.
Wyoming.
I'm just kidding.
Oh, funny.
I'm just kidding.
I've been there. It's not bad.
Wyoming is
Wyoming?
beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Jackson,
Quiet.
Jackson, Wyoming is nice.
I've been over 20 states, especially like close to West Central America. It's beautiful, but it's boring. It's really boring. There's nothing to do. Nebraska, Idaho, Iowa, it's nothing, like it's just like yeah, just horses, farms.
I guess.
Most supporters.
Yeah. You're not gonna find like different type of people. Only white people mostly. 98%. Like you stop in truck like gas station. Only country music. Ding, 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 ding. Like, people are totally different. But it's quiet. If you have family, you wanna live a
Several,
peaceful life. Why not?
Okay, we'll look for some jobs for you in Nebraska.
If it's good pay,
Yeah.
like it's good.
Well, you don't need a lot of money to stay there. No, it's mostly East Coast and West Coast, wherever the tech companies are, right? But also like there are jobs in a lot of the jobs in Texas. Texas is huge.
Nice.
Like a lot of our students are in Texas.
Like Houston.
Everywhere in Texas, Dallas, Houston, Austin. Yeah. Austin is pretty, and then Charlotte is pretty. North Carolina.
No, I've heard in Texas no income tax.
Oh yeah, and those are your personal details, but I'm just saying like overall. Yeah. Florida also doesn't have income tax. A lot of the students in Florida too. Yeah.
Look at that if you meet like over 90,000.
What about California?
California is big, but California is so far, right? So like, expensive. So you talked about state tax, right?
You can find a lot of jobs.
Yeah, but living cost is very expensive in California. So 13% state tax. So every $100 you make.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, let's say if you're in tech, so
But easy to get the jobs.
I don't think getting easy part is very, I think, overplayed these days, right?
Nothing's easy.
Nothing is easy. You have to work for it. All right, we're gonna get started. Everyone. All right. So right after the development phase, we have a testing phase, right? I mean, this is kind of what we work on, but we'll create our own life cycle as well, right? What do we do on day to day? What our main core responsibilities are, right? Not necessarily you'll do all of them, but you'll definitely be doing some of them, right? So testing is where testing phase of SDLC is arguably one of the, well, I didn't say that, by the way, one of the most important, right? It is impossible to deliver a quality software without testing. There is a wide variety of testing necessary to measure quality. I mean, there's no way we can build a team today without testing. It's just not possible anymore, right? If you're a startup, VCs will not fund you if you don't have testing team, right? If you are a consulting company, if your client doesn't have testing, they're gonna question that, right? If you're working for a big enterprise solution, you must have, project managers must have testing, and so it's and that's why you guys are here, right? This thing works. There's jobs out there, right? But you have to be trained and know what you're doing. So within testing, there are a lot of different type of testing, and we'll go over that each one of those within next couple of classes, right? But just high level, we have unit testing, and also testing is not only QA's job. So that's one thing. I want you to guys, like when you go to an interview, like this is the very first question you want to ask. It's like, hey, they might ask you, is testing QA's job? Right? Your answer should be no. It's not just QA's job, it's everyone's job, right? So you have from product manager to design to coder, right? To QA team, everyone's job is testing. Everyone should test what they're working on, right? But QA has obviously the gatekeeper of all of that, right? Proper documentation, automation scripts to help you, uh, move the testing faster and all of that different stuff, right? Also the gatekeeper for release and all of that stuff. But testing should be everyone's job, right? It's not just QA team's job. So that's the first thing you want to take away from that. Um, there's something called unit testing, functional testing, integration testing, performance testing, and security testing. Out of all of that, to be honest with you, your responsibility might just be those two, right? Unit testing is something that gets done by developers. What that means is, and we'll go over unit testing in more details later. Um, that's a developer in a function, right? A function that adds to value, right? But how do you know it's working? So they will write some unit tests and you know, send some values like negative value, positive values, just to make sure if they both are working, right? So those are called just specific method or function that is being tested, right? Not the full picture or full end-to-end flow, right? How addition works, that's not what we're focusing on, or calculator works. We're just focusing on, hey, does this function add to value, right? But you can't test it manually. You have to write a code for that, right? So, but that's developer team's job, right? So that we're not doing that as a QA team, right? And then you focus on functional testing. So within functional testing, a lot of different types of testing. We'll go over that later. But mainly high level, you want to make sure that the code application is working as expected. That's the high level, definition for that of what functional testing. Integration testing. If we go back to I think this diagram that we built, right? So let's say we have another API that speaks to our API, right? So let's say we have another application that speaks to our applications, right? So our application, think of like a Facebook, but the Facebook uses Google Maps, right? For whatever reason. So these integrations, you want to make sure that's working, right? So that's, you can think of like different modules coming together and make sure all of the modules are working as expected, right? So that's what high level. These are all high level. We're going to go into details of what integration testing and all of that later. And then you have some non-functional testing like performance testing and security testing. Honestly, like I've done performance probably like 7 years ago once. Ever since then, like I never looked at it, right? It's usually kind of get done through, because of all this cloud platform that teams are, companies are using, like, IBM Cloud or AWS, like Amazon Cloud, Google Cloud. Those teams kind of takes care of that. Or there's another team called DevOps who kind of maintains all of the performances and all of those different stuff and security stuff. So it kind of falls under that team. But if someone is looking for a performance tester and security testing, that's not your job, right? You shouldn't apply for that job, right? So that's not what you're gonna learn here. But these are two different type of testing as well, and we'll go over those in details of what those are as well. Best way to ensure the tests are run regularly and never skipped or experienced is to automate them, right? So that's the key. We need to make sure we automate all of the tests. And how do you automate them? You have to programmatically write your tests so that you don't have to manually do your testing. Within testing, you have test management, like I said, functional testing, user experience testing, right? So when you talked about user experience, so whatever final user experience prototype that we finalize on, make sure you have to test that. We talked about performance and load testing. You want to make sure that performance of your app, not just functionality of your app, but let's say if you have 10,000 users got into your applications, is your server is taking the load, right? How the response times are. Is that, longer than a minute? Let's say you click on a button, you're making a payment, and it's, it's spinning. We all face that, right? So if too many users are getting into the applications, the performance of the application is slowing down. So that means that's something the networking team has to deal with to make sure we add more servers to those applications, right? Um, Capability testing. Not sure exactly what they do, but probably just testing like a lot of the different aspects of that. But I'm not really sure. There's a lot of term you'll hear. Like if you Google how many type of testing out there, there's like 30 of those, right? Or 40, 50 of those. I don't even know like 90% of them, right? So mainly you just want to focus on the functional and integrations and explain what it is. Talked about security testing. So authentication is very important these days, right? A lot of scams happening, right? So these days there's a new type of authentication that started, is MFA, right? Multi-factor authentications. So if you enable that, let's say for your Gmail, so when you try to log in, they will text message you like a short code, and you enter that code, and then authenticate you, say now this is the right person, right? So this is so I'm just saying in a high level from a development point of view what security testing is, right? But then whoever is specialized on security testing, they do a lot of different other type of testing and that. We talked about test management. I I don't like to use word like passion and attitude, like they don't have a content, right? So, but at the same time, for you to be a good software, I think automation engineer or tester, obviously we all have decent verbal and written communication. Um, Passion, like I said, it's kind of an overplayed term, right? But obviously you have some drive so that you're here today, right? Either to get a job or either to start a new career, right? Or you're struggling with your current job or you want to change something, right? So if that's the case, then when you're here, don't waste your time, right? Just make sure like you're here every day, you're doing the homework, you're doing all of that stuff. So for me, that's what passion is. It's not like, oh, I'm super excited to be a test automation engineer, right? It's the reality is that you need something after this, right? You want to build a career, and this is kind of an emerging field right now. So it's a good time to get in, but at the same time, you can have all the passion you want, but if you're not doing your homework, and if you're not improving, not just doing homework, you need to continue to improve, then it's not going to work out for you, right? Um, Technical skills, right? So this is another thing. Like, let's say you run into an issue, don't panic, right? Nothing's gonna happen. This is just a course. You're in a classroom. So if you run into an issue, ask someone that's next to you, right? But don't bother them too much now on every single details. So make sure you run into an issue, try to solve it. Maybe Google that error, see what other people are saying, right? So try to solve it that way. Analytical skills, obviously that's pretty much we all kind of have to have for any job. So I'm gonna skip that. Obviously, right attitude. So this is very important. So let's say someone is tough on you, either Deepak or myself, right? And don't take it personal, right? As much as you want the job, we want to get you the job, right? That's where everybody benefits. But there are sometimes we have to tell you how it is, right? If you suck at something, we have to tell you, hey, you're not improving here. You missed last 3 homework. How do you expect to finish this? You know, crazy algorithm type of solutions, right? You just can't do it. So you have don't take it personal. It's all for your own good. But if you're not doing your work, these guys track homework, you submit it, and you missed last 3 homework, and you come to us and say, hey, I don't know how to do this. That's not fair, right? Like I said, this course is, I guess, like 20% us, 80% you. You have to put in the work. If you're not putting the work, it's just like watching a lecture here or watching it online. It means, it's the same thing. So obviously, combination of all that, some productivity is important. So not just doing homework is not enough, right? You can do homework all the time, but if you're not doing it right, that also doesn't help. So if you, based on the feedback, try to improve, right? And everybody has a different learning curve. So, if someone else can learn much faster. We don't know their background, right? Maybe he was a software engineer in the past, right? Or maybe that person just knows how to learn things a little bit faster. But that does not mean that you're not good. You have a different curve, right? So make sure from today till 2 weeks, what improvement did you make, right? Not compared to the person next to you, but just self-assess yourself, right? So that's very important, and that's how you can add productivity. Since we're in the thought, I missed out to say one thing. So I travel a lot for a job, right? So that's now is the summer season coming, so it's pretty okay, right? The weathers are, you know, decent, right? But winter season, sometimes, let's say if I'm in California, if my flight is delayed and stuff like that, I may miss a class, right? But I'll definitely notify you guys. Usually, if it's a topic that Deepak can take, I'll let him take. But there's a few topics that he's really good at. So those are the ones you can take, or we'll make up that class. We're not gonna skip it. We'll make it up at some point, either on that month or toward the end of the class, of course, right? Because it's not like we're gonna skip the material. The materials are gonna be intact. We may, overlap a week or something down the road. Obviously, if I get sick, that's I don't think anyone wants me to be here. But taking all that into account. So just a traveling factor is the only thing. Sometimes might get canceled. All right, so that's kind of high level what the testing phase does, and then you're in deployment. So this is very important, and a lot of new terms are going to be introduced here. So the deployment phase is ideally a highly automated phase, right? So there's nothing manual going on here, maybe, but most of the time it's all automated. But that's not something we do, right? This is something that gets done by another team called DevOps, right? So all of those things, every slide that I went through, there are different teams that are doing different things, right? Testing is the only thing that we need to focus. But even within testing, you're not doing everything. You're doing maybe like 10% of the testing job, right? So there are other manual testing, like I said, performance testing, security testing, right? So there's so many different types of testing. When it comes to deployment, this is something DevOps does, right? So in this phase is almost, it's kind of invisible in a sense, like we don't really have to be crazy involved. We just have to make sure that, you have the dev environment, QA environment, and prod environment. And we'll talk about each of those environments a little bit. Software is developed, in instance, it is ready, enterprise with lower maturity and some higher regulatory industry. The process involves some manual approvals, right? However, even those cases, it's best for deployment itself to be fully automated, right? So today's day and age, what we are doing is continuous development, right? CI/CD, continuous integration, and continuous development. You'll hear that a lot in your job description, right? All that means is once the code is merged, right, we make your automated test gets executed, test passes, automated deployment happens to production. Does that make sense? But in reality, that never happens, right? Everybody is scared and panic. So we still keep some of the stuff manual. Not the testing part of it, the regression testing part of it, but at least the deployment you want to double check, or you don't make the release so that if you have 100,000 users, you don't want to release it to 100,000 users, so we do incremental release, right? So 5% of the user, 10%, and if it's continue to be stable, then we make that proper release. But you can write script for all of that stuff, right? Application release, ARA tools are used to medium and large size enterprise automated. We're going to learn this a little bit, right? Toward the end of our class, like in the final project, we're going to do the continuous deployment as well, right? I mean, continuous, the testing part of what continuous deployment is, like what our role is. We're going to be installing Jenkins and stuff like that, and read code from our GitHub, and then do automatic testing and stuff like that, right? So ARA systems are usually integrated with the continuous integration tool. The output of this phase is release production of a working software. So that's the whole goal, is to make sure we get this process. So let's say in this phase, you say, you know what, testing is good, the application looks good, right? Everything is good to go. We give you okay for release, right? So it will create a request is created. does it require any approval? So let's say if you're working for some highly regulated companies, right? Pharmaceutical companies and things like that, or aeronautic, like a plane or Boeing and like that kind of companies, it's very highly regulated, right? So if it requires, based on the future, so let's say someone has to approve this manually. If it requires approval, then obviously you get that approval, right? But most of the time, it's automatically approved, right? And it goes through a deployment workflow, right? Again, this is not something we do, but I thought it would be good to go over that workflow. So you start your deployment workflow here, create the deployment request, update config manager collections, right? Wait for installation result. If you get a success, right? And then if the success, the final result comes in as success. It's like whenever you install a software, right? And it finally says, okay, success, that means it's good to go, right? So we when we deploy it to production, we also get some sort of response back, right? Success or failure. If it's failure, we get an error of why it failed. So if it's success, then we say yes, okay, request is completed, right? If it's some sort of a failure happened, so it'll create an incident, and then this request is completed, right? But we have to now go and do the autopsy on why it fell, right? And then based on that, we will pretty much create a new request. If it's a development problem or, you know, a very common problem, what happens is, let's say if there is a code that needs to be only on prod, but the programmer wrote a logic for environment to be QA. So now when it goes to prod, it's looking for QA, right? So it's just gonna throw like the app is gonna crash or something like that, right? So and I'll talk about what I mean by environment in a little bit. But in high level, this is kind of the deployment process. So I know it's a lot to take today, but you don't have to memorize all of those things. But you have to understand, even though we're all using software, but you have to know there's a lot of people work behind it to make it work. There's a lot of engineering works, right? Each team has tons of people to work on these things, right? Any questions on deployment? All right. Oh, finally, maintenance, just high level, is a support thing, right? So let's say once you made the deployment, if there is some issues and things like that, you kind of come back and either you send an email if that's how they communicate as far as app support goes, or you make a call and they will create an incident or an issue, and then someone from dev team or app support management team will classify, is this an coding issue or is this something the user just needs to learn how to use it, right? But that's pretty much what maintenance. We don't really deal with that a lot. Um, but high level, any questions on that entire SDLC flow? It's not a lot, but you have to understand how each team works. So in next class, when you come in, we have some quizzes and stuff ready for you. So make sure you review these things, get some of those terminologies correct, and then when you come on Thursday, so you're kind of ready for that quiz, so you can assess yourself, right? All right. So you can leave that for now. Okay, so we understand, okay, there's something called SDLC. This is the flow that we have to work with, but it's still not, the guidance is still not there, right? So we need a little bit more guidance, right? We need to understand, okay, how does our day goes by? How does our week goes by, right? How do we actually roll out a product into production, right? So yes, we can follow all those things and it still may lead into and it has led into problems in the past, right? So there is a methodology called um, Agile, right? So what is an Agile? So Agile is kind of a software, not just software. I think you pretty much can build any type of product using Agile methodologies. But Agile has a bunch of different ones. That Agile itself, there are teams that goes into companies and they train people of how to use Agile, um, how to develop product more efficiently, and this and that. It's a process. It's a process to build any type of product, right? It could be a financial product, like or electric engineering product or whatnot. But in our case, most of the time we use something called Scrum, right? So within Agile, the type of methodology that we are using is Scrum. It's very important that you understand SDLC and Agile because that's your first question in an interview, right? Can you walk me through your Agile workflow? What do you do day to day, right? I promise you that. That's how it starts, and then they'll go a little bit more. Are you okay? Sum of two values from an array or something like that. So that's later. If you can't pass through that, we're not going into technical interviews, right? So make sure that we understand how Agile works. So I'm not gonna. This is not an Agile-based course. We only need to understand how Scrum works, right? So you'll say within Agile, you're familiar with how Scrum works, and then you explain what a Scrum is, right? So Scrum is one of the Agile methodologies designed to guide teams in the iterative and incremental delivery of a product, right? Often referred to as an Agile project management framework. Its focus is on use of hierarchical process that allows teams to respond rapidly, efficiently, and effectively to change. So all these words don't mean anything unless we know what they mean by, right? And the subsequent slides will kind of back that up, right? Um, so it's like you say, hey, I want you to be good. But what do you mean by good, right? Tell me a few things that I have to do so that I can be good, right? So that's kind of what they have to support based on what they're saying here. Traditionally, project management method fixed requirements in an effort to control time and cost. So traditionally, we used to do, okay, we'll just gather requirements, right? And then we'll take the requirement, give it to design, and then design will send it to development. Development will send it. So it's called like a waterfall methodology, right? And the whole purpose, and nobody uses that anymore. And the whole purpose of this was to control time and cost, right? You could probably hire a tester like after half of your project is done, right? But when you bring in a team where all the project is pretty much half 50% is done, you're not gonna have a good product, right? If they don't understand the product well. I mean, as much as you have to be good in coding and stuff like that, you also have to be good understanding the product, right? Let's say if you're working for a Wall Street firm that does trading, right? Like let's say a current company that pretty much I'm working on. As much as good of a programmer that I have to be, I also have to understand how trading works, right? And sometimes I look back, maybe I should have been a trader, right? Because then it would have been a lot more money, and it's you know so you have to understand the domain so well so you can code well, right? Or test well. If you don't understand the domain, what are you going to test? So you have to know all the financial terms and workflows and things like that. But don't worry. Like once you kind of get to the job, you spend time, and you're not gonna. If you go into Amazon and work for Amazon, you don't have to know everything one day, right? Whatever is kind of given to you, slowly learn, and over the years you gain that experience, right? So in the past, we used to do like one after one step after another step and do go through with that. But that's not anymore. This is done using the time boxes, collaboration ceremonies, and prioritizing product backlog and frequent feedback cycles. The improvement of the business throughout the project is critical as Scrum relies heavily on collaboration between the team and um, customer representative and create the right product in lean fashion. So we're not trying to build a massive like a huge product, right? Just off the gate, So what we focus on, let's say if we were to build Facebook all over again, well, let's focus on registration and login now, right? Without those, you can't really do anything. So first 2 weeks, we'll just do that, and then, and if you guys remember the future like poke or something like that, right? So okay, we'll focus on, I don't know, maybe invite. You can add a friend, you can send a request, and you can add a friend, and you can maybe poke a friend, right? Let's just add that, right? Okay, 3 months pass by. Let's add a functionality of adding comments, right? As easy as those things it sounds, they're not easy to build. It's a lot of complexity building even comments, right? Because you have to make sure, like, wherever, which user are you sending the comments to, which message, based on which post are you sending comments. All these logics are very complex to write. So you need time, and so we are not something that we're not deciding, for 6 months, hey, we're gonna build this massive product called Facebook, and we're gonna roll it out, right? It's harder to get feedback. Now you invested all this money, but the feedback is like, if people don't like it, right? So now, instead of doing that, we're saying, okay, no, we're gonna be doing incremental development. We'll send out one feature at a time. We'll get feedback, and based on feedback, we'll continue to iterate, right? So therefore, you need requirement, design, development, and testing, and every sprint and every day, right? So when the developers are working on current requirement, product is working on future requirement, right? What's gonna happen next week, right? And design is probably working on what product is giving them, right? Tester is probably working on also current requirement to make sure the testing goes well, right? So every team is always busy with something, always being creative of, what has to happen next. So in high level, that's what Agile is. And if you look at the workflow of an Agile, it's pretty easy. You have the product owner, so you have your product backlog. So product backlog, another one, means all your requirements that needs to get automated. So when you become an automation engineer, you're also going to have a product backlog, but instead of like a business requirement, it's going to be test that needs to kind of get automated. It could be back-end test, front-end test, whatnot. So that's what you are. That's what the product backlog is. It's where you store all your requirements that needs to get built, through next 3 months or 6 months or whatever the duration of that specific project. Then you go into sprint planning meeting, right? We'll talk about what do we do in sprint planning. Pretty much just decide what are we going to work on next 2 weeks, right? So that's what the focus on, and based on what we decide, we grab those requirements and we dump it into sprint backlog. So there's a sprint backlog is what we're going to be working on a given sprint, and product backlog is the entire project requirements that we have to do. So product backlog is pretty much maintained by product owner, but the sprint planning and sprint backlog is where entire team is integrated, right? So you have design is involved there, as well as product, dev, and test, right? And then it goes through this sprint, 1 to 4 weeks, right? But it's not 1 to 4 weeks, at your choice. So the team will decide, okay, we're going to do sprint every 2 weeks. Most of the time it's 2 weeks, but it's constant, right? It doesn't change. So next sprint is not going to be 3 weeks. It's still going to be 2 weeks. So it's continuously going to be 2 weeks, right? But within these 2 weeks, every morning, which is Monday to Friday, the working days, you're going to have a daily meeting of talking about what you did yesterday, what are you going to work on today, and are you blocked by something? So you might say, hey, I'm trying to hit this Google API, and it's giving me an error saying account denied or something like that, right? So maybe this is not a coding issue. Maybe this is something that finance team has to deal with, paying Google or whatever, right? So things like that can run in. Or you might say, oh, we tried to make a deployment yesterday and it was rejected, right? Remember we went to a deployment phase? So, and I think the deployment team came back and said it's some coding issue, but I can't figure this out. Can we do this in a group, right? So all of those things can happen. Or if you're a test engineer, you can say, hey, I'm trying to understand this workflow, but it's not working. You can sit down with the product manager again, and he'll walk you through what you have to do, all right? So all of those questions can be addressed during the morning meeting. Who's involved there? We'll go over the daily scrum itself later. And then finally, after 2 weeks, you finish the work, and then we do usually you just do one meeting, right? Sprint review and sprint retrospective, just to understand, okay, what have we, initial from sprint planning, let's say we set out to do 5 tickets, right? We ended up doing 4. We have to move that 5th one into the next sprint, right? We don't extend the length of the sprint, we just move that ticket to the next sprint, right? And then we decide, do we make a release with those 4 tickets, right? But those 4 tickets may not have any value unless we actually implement the 5th ticket. So these are the decision making that happens. So it's not just one person making all the decisions, like a manager that sit there and just making decisions. No, it's a team effort, and everyone kind of collaborates and finally say, no, okay, we can make a release and whatnot, and all those decision making that's kind of happens here. It's pretty simple workflow, right? Any questions here? So this is the model that you're going to work on. Like by end of this course, you're working on this, right? Your final project follows this model, right? So you're going to be doing all of those things that we are doing, that shows in this. And when you go into an interview, you have to explain this. There's no other way. It's easy. It's just you have to know this, right? This is not hard, but put some effort in it and kind of go over it once you get home. So we talked about product backlog. So let's talk about product backlog in details, right? So product backlog, the simplest definition of Scrum product backlog is simply a list of all things that needs to be done within the project, right? And that can add, that can grow or shrink, right? So let's say the team did more research, more user research, so they can dump more tickets in here, right? Or let's say, we got feedback about certain features that we were going to do in 2 weeks, but you know what, we're not going to do this because it's not adding any more value or whatever. We'll take them out as well. So you have the flexibility of do all of that. But this is where all of your tickets that needs to be done within the project, it replaces the traditional requirements specification artifacts. These items can have technical nature or can be user-centric in form of user stories. So like one of my first job, a long time ago when I got it, I go in there, very first day, they send me a functional requirement document that was this big, right? I had no idea what to do with it, right? So because you have to literally, they expect you to know the entire application. So that was kind of the older flow. But now someone can just give you this backlog and say, hey, just review those 4 tickets, right? Try to understand those, and from there on, you can go. Most of the teams are obviously made the transition into this model. Some teams may still have the old model, but probably in the process of making into thing. So how does a backlog looks like? So let me just show you our current project that, last batch students are working on final project now. So, it will be something like this. So they're working on 4, we just worked on the first sprint. So they're working on these 3 tickets. And then within the ticket, we have a backlog of stuff that they have to finish, right? And then we can track what's happening on an active sprint. So we can see, oh, well, these are the tickets that's happening. And you see how some of them are in peer review, which means it's ready for either Deepak or myself to review these tasks. Some of them are in progress. Some of them are still in due. Some of them doing the testing. So our review session is tomorrow. That's why they're all pretty much in review. So we can kind of pretty much track, okay, who's working on it, and all of those different things. It's not to track or do micromanagement, but yet it is doing micromanagement, right? But you don't have to kind of manually, that's not the purpose for it. It's just to see your progress or health of this board, and so to speak. So toward the end, so that's what that means by backlog, right? Everything that we have to automate in this project, right? But then you have the sprint backlog is everything that we're going to be working on a given sprint, which is in our case is 1 week, but in most cases it's 2 weeks. All right. Any questions on product backlog or sprint workflow? It's very important you understand all of that. I hope you're getting enough visual to understand these things, right? Again, sprint backlog is nothing different, right? It's just the tickets that we are going to be working on a given sprint. That's all it is, right? So if we go back to this one, it's just with these 3 tickets that we're going to be working this week, right? Um, and that's that. If you're wondering what is going to be your final project, so it's really something like that. Okay, current temperature should not be greater or less than the temperature from daily timeline, right? So these are like some of the tasks that you're going to have to be, but you're coding that. You're coding the entire, um, workflow. And then comes, okay, well, what is a sprint, right? We talked about sprint a little bit, but in Scrum framework, all activity needs for implementation of an entries of a Scrum product backlog as a performed with the sprint. So sprints are always short, normally about 2 to 4 weeks, right? So like I say, it's usually just most of the time it's 2 weeks, right? Each sprint follows a defined process as shown below. So you have the stakeholder, say, update the product backlog, we do the sprint planning sessions. So this is where we do sprint planning and sprint meeting or whatever you want to call it. And it goes through the daily sprint meetings, right? We'll review that as well. And then finally sprint review session. And after that, we decide potential delivery product and we make a release, right? And after that, we do kind of like a review of the entire sprint and talk about, okay, what went right, what went wrong, and all of that stuff. So there isn't a lot of meetings. And it may seem like you're doing a lot of meetings and stuff, but within those 2 weeks, you're pretty much doing one meeting here, one review meeting, and then the daily 10 minutes meeting. So it's actually not a lot of meetings. It's actually more work and less meetings. That's how it ends up being. But in high level, this is what you're doing in a sprint. Any questions on what is a sprint? And to support this entire Scrum model, we have this tool, like I said, Jira. So it gives you the backlog, and then it tells you, what's happening in your sprint as well, right? So this is the tool. This is pretty much the industry standard of what people use these days. So then comes, okay, well, sprint planning. What do we do in sprint planning? A lot, right? Each sprint planning, each sprint starts with 2 planning sessions to define the content of the sprint. So let's say the what meeting and the how meeting, right? So you kind of, what are we doing and how are we going to do, right? So it's very important that you understand how are you going to do. So we can do one of the ticket together to understand how the sprint planning happens. The combination of those 2 meetings are also defined as sprint planning meeting, right? So we decide what are we going to do and how are we going to do. So what is sometimes easy, how is the difficult part, right? So that's where we have to invest a lot of time of how are we going to implement something like that. So what meeting the Scrum team commits to the user stories from the Scrum product backlog and uses how meeting to break committed user story into smaller and concrete tasks, then implementation begins. So in high level, all you want to focus on is that, okay, we decided we are going to do these 3 tickets, right? That's the priority now. That's what the business wants us to do, right? It's important for the business. But now the second part of that sprint planning is, okay, let's break it down. How are we going to do this? Is this a 1 ticket job, or do we have to break this into 5 different sub tickets, right? Like a subtask and assign it to 5 different developers. So those are the decisions that needs to get made. So let's assume one of our tickets from backlog, and we're saying, okay, we want to verify the temperature timeline on dark sky side, right? So this is what we want to do. And this is something the last batch students are doing right now, right? So if we open up the ticket, open a new link. This is the scenario they have to automate. So verify timeline is displayed in correct format. So given you're in the home page, then I verify the timeline is displayed within 2 hours incremented. So you want to kind of make sure this scenario is automated, right? You have to write a script to automate that. Well, let's talk about what that scenario is. So this is what you kind of do during your sprint planning. Go over the existing tickets, right? And you see how I create a subtask for everyone that's attending the final project, right? So everyone I can follow who's doing what and whatnot, right? And so the idea, what I want them to do is, you see this timeline? I want them to grab this timeline and make sure this timeline, the time is incremented by 2 hours from the current time, right? So let's say right now is 9 o'clock. So it does 2 hours. So you take the 2 hours, the current 2 hours, and make sure it's okay. From 8 is 10, 12 to 4. It's not the easiest test. It's actually pretty complex, right? But you don't have to worry about that today, right? You can worry about that in 4 months later. But for now, so these are the kind of tests we talk about, right? So they might ask questions, hey, Mohammed, do you want me to compare AM and PM, right? So you see how AM and PM is there. So this is not specified in my ticket, right? So this is a discussion. So when you become an engineer and have some engineering training, you're going to start asking those detail-based questions, because engineering is all about being detailed. Every step has to be specified and clarified. So they're going to start asking me these questions saying, hey, okay, do you want me to verify PM and AM as well? Because if not, then their life is a little bit easier, right? So that's kind of, I might say, no, well, chances are I'm going to make it harder, right? So I said, no, I want you to compare that as well. I also, then they might ask, well, do you want me to also verify the first value, which is not a time, it just says now, right? Well, I might say yes, I want you to also verify the first value. So these are the discussion that kind of takes place on sprint planning. All right, any questions about sprint planning? So whatever the inputs is, you do some sprint planning, and then you do your outputs and create the sprint goal, what we want to achieve from that sprint, and what should be in the sprint backlog, right? Daily Scrum meeting is just, it's just something like, you kind of just go over, right? So you have 15 minutes meetings every morning, same place, same time, and then you have someone kind of just starts up the meeting. So that's the person that you call Scrum Master, right? Nothing really, full team is probably present. So this meeting, you may have two Scrum meetings too, right? You may have a Scrum meeting with just your QA team, right? And you may have a Scrum meeting with everyone, like design, dev, product, right? So probably you're just gonna attend probably have two. So one to just give QA updates, one to just understand the product update. Does that make sense? So you might, let's say if your QA team has 4 members, not everyone probably has to attend the other ones. Whoever the lead or manager, well, not manager doesn't make sense. So lead, whoever's kind of the lead person, that can attend the other Scrum meetings. All right. And then you just focus on 3 questions, right? What I did yesterday, what I'll do today, and what is on my way. So kind of like a blocker, right? If you have, we talked about that a little bit, right? So what did you work on yesterday? You can say, well, I actually did the sketch and design for the timeline scenario that we were going to work on, right? Today, I'm actually going to work on writing the code for that, right? To make the validations and make sure that every hours is pretty much, the timeline is incremented by 2 hours. So you can kind of answer those questions during this, and then say, well, if you don't have any blockers, say, no, you're good to go. You kind of finish that by end of the day, right? So there are pressures, and I don't want you to think that this job is very easy or anything like that. There are a lot of pressures there. It's challenging, but you have to be kind of dedicated to work next few months to get there, right? Any questions on? All right. Finally, sprint review and retrospective, right? So you can read all these materials, but just high level is, it's about determining the work that was just completed. You just kind of review all the work and make a decision. Do we make a release or do we not make a release? That's pretty much the bottom line, right? If we don't make the release, we wait another sprint to finish more work and push them together and then go out. But if there is something called hot fix is something like, let's say if there's a bug happen in production, right? And needs to get fixed right now, and that means we have to push this out, right? So all those decisions kind of happens here. Usually those two meetings is just one meeting, and then the second part of the meeting is about identifying areas of improvement to make the next sprint better. So you can discuss something like, hey, I opened a peer review, Mohammed doesn't review it on time, so that means it's costing us, more time to kind of, ticket to finish. So it's, what you see in the sprint full picture, it's not. So it's not about pointing fingers. It's more like identifying the issue and be straight about it and just kind of say, this is what's happening. And I feel like we need to make improvement there for us to meet our sprint goals. So you can kind of openly discuss what's happening, what's not. So that's that. Any questions? So a lot of information today, right? So, but you don't have to know everything. This is the entire software development lifecycle. In our next class, we focus on testing, right? So we'll focus on testing lifecycle, and we'll start writing some manual test cases. Now, automation test cases, manual test cases, and things like that. We'll have some classwork. We'll have quiz about those two things, right? It's 9:05. We're not finishing early. What we are gonna do is, I want to make sure I have everyone's email. I want to make sure everyone's in the Slack room, and get all those administration stuff kind of done before we go on to the next. Usually the class will start at, like I said, 7 o'clock. We'll, if it's a lot of lecture, we usually try to finish early because it's hard to speak for 3 hours, right? But if we have a combination of classwork and lecture, usually it'll run until like 9:20 or so, and then we'll have some Q&A sessions and things like that toward the end, or if you want to have like a smaller group discussions and things like that, all right? Any questions?
What kind of languages are gonna be needed for all this QA? Like,
What language are we going to
Java.
learn? Java, that's it. Mainly.
That's it?
That's it. Well, that's a lot itself, okay?
My board languages.
You don't need to learn a lot of languages to do your work, right? The key thing is to understand what you're trying to do. Language is just supporting, it's just a supporting fact. Like, it's not necessary, obviously without that you can't do anything, but you have to understand what you're trying to do. Like today, if you go learn Java in Udemy without knowing what you're trying to do, it doesn't add any value. First, you have to understand what the problem is, what you're trying to solve, and then learn the language, right?
Basically, like all the software are being made in Java.
No. It's a combination of a lot of all languages like Python, JavaScript.
But we're gonna be dealing in Java.
Oh, yeah, you have to choose one, right? And Java is still 60% of automation engineers from our here are getting placed in Java-based frameworks. So that's the reason for choosing Java. Java is not like my favorite language or anything like that. In fact, it's a very strict language. So, but it's what helps students learn better. Like I say, it's very strict, right? So
Would we be able to deal with other like languages? Like if we're doing the testing, would we have to deal with other languages as well? How are we gonna deal with that?
don't worry about that. We'll get there, right? You guys.
Also, we'll use Eclipse to write.
No, we'll use IntelliJ IDEA. Yeah. I know a lot of you guys like Eclipse, right? IntelliJ is a little better. I think you'll grow into it.
What is it?
It's a software. We'll get there once we start getting with Java. Any questions regarding besides Java? Any questions regarding today's class? We have to deal with the boring stuff a little bit
Yeah,
too.
like basic of what, I think basic like how does this job work? Like is it a teamwork? How does it go?
What do you mean?
Like when we got a job like for a QA, does the job work as a team? The people are working as a team.
Of course, right? That's the whole purpose of what we talked about here, right? So without the team, there's no way you can do this thing. There is product planning, you have design, you have development, you're just
Just talking about the testing team. So there has to be a team, or is gonna be one person doing all the testing?
it totally depends, right?
So it's gonna
You can be in a small company where you're the only person doing it. Maybe it's a small product, right? You could be in a company where there's 20 people on the team, right? So it totally depends. I can answer you that. But those things doesn't matter, right? As long as you know what you're doing. If ultimately you are working individually, right? No one's gonna do your work. So it's end of the day, you are doing an individual work, but at the same time, it is a team effort, right? You guys okay over there? Any questions? All right. Any questions from online? All right. So no questions from online. So what I'm going to do is I'll spend some time with Deepak to also understand, whose emails is missing and update our backlog of emails and things like that. Now, first of all, who is not in Slack? So you're not in Slack. Now, second is who's in Slack, but you're not invited to the room yet. All right, so those of you stay, right? And the rest of you, if you don't have any questions, I'll see you all on Thursday. All right?
I don't have this material.
I'm gonna share this after the class.
Okay.
All right. You can accept to. You will receive a video from today's class and the materials. All right.
Thank you.